the budget was structured the way it was, perhaps because a lot had to be then diverted to health this year, given that, health suddenly became a bigger priority. So therefore, I would say that there could have been a lot more that the budget could have offered the education sector in terms of the hygiene and the safety elements. One is really trying to understand why. Is it because the center expects the states to step in and take on some of this? But overall, I think there should have been more thought to the specific circumstances that schools are going to be reopening under.
The overall budget of allocated for education has reduced by about 6%. Now, what, according to you, what kind of message does that send the country or send the people that in a year where the coronavirus pandemic has led to a lot of learning losses, what kind of message do you think this sends?
So I think there isn't a simple, straightforward answer to that because, I think reading of the budget has to be nuanced and in context. So my response is not going to be a straight, it's unacceptable or that it's bad news overall. But one needs to understand that education is a concurrent list in India, which means that it's a combination of the union budget as well as the state budget. And for most states, including Tamil Nadu, a majority of the education budget actually comes from the state budget. And only about 10% of the overall, total state budget for education is from the union budget. So in that sense, what happens on the ground in schools when schools reopen? Yes, of course, there was a huge expectation from the union budget that it would look at, aspects of hygiene, of safety, of, water, of sanitation. So therefore, those elements being completely left out did come as, I think, a shock for those of us in education. But I think end of the day, we'll need to look at what the state intends to do when schools reopen as well. And I'm speaking specifically from a Tamil Nadu lens, given that we're working in Tamil Nadu. Certainly, it doesn't send out the right kind of signals. And if one has to really try and understand why the budget was structured the way it was, perhaps because a lot had to be then diverted to health this year, given that, health suddenly became a bigger priority. So therefore, I would say that there could have been a lot more that the budget could have offered the education sector in terms of the hygiene and the safety elements. There's also the threat of a lot of dropouts from the system that's looming ahead of us, right? Given that especially girls dropping out and rejoining labor, those elements were completely left out of the budget. And one is really trying to understand why. Is it because the center expects the states to step in and take on some of this? But overall, I think that there should have been more thought to the specific circumstances that schools are going to be reopening under. But again, it's been a difficult year for the country as a whole, the economy as a whole.
From that, let me just ask you then the counter to this, which is essentially that, okay, then what are some things that you think the education budget or the budget that's been structured for the education sector, what are some things that it's gotten right?
That's also a difficult question to answer because, I wouldn't say that it's done something to target the corona specific concerns for education at all. In fact, even when it comes to, this was also the year of the NEP, right? The National Education Policy. So if you look at the Annexure 5 of the budget, which specifically talks about the allocations or the stipulations for items under the NEP, it still doesn't deal with it in as much depth as it should have. So I'm not saying that the budget got it right and therefore there isn't a need to critique it or a need to demand for a better budget next year, or that that people who are pointing fingers at it are entirely wrong. But I'm just trying to think of it from a lens of could we have done more in a year like that? And the answer perhaps to that is perhaps not. Perhaps the kind of revenue receipts that we did receive as an economy did take a dip, right? So the overall pool or the overall pie that you could carve education budget out of itself had become smaller. So expectedly and consequently the education budget did get cut down by 6%. And when that happens, and given that a vast majority of that budget actually goes towards teachers' salaries, and this year it's not like teachers were given a pay cut. So it is not like you were saving anything from any of these measures that you could redirect to other components within education. So I think it's just a bad year for education. So it is now contingent on the state governments to step up, to again look at what is it that they can redirect internally. Again, if you look at the irony, there is a state like Tamil Nadu spends about 70 to 80% of its budget on teacher salaries, right? So you have a small percentage of the 20% remaining that needs to account for everything else, including now student incentives like bags and uniforms and things like that, which again form I think about 5 to 7% of the state budget. So that's 90% of your budget gone, right? So there's very little that can be played with for specific schemes in the light of corona that a state wants to announce, and it remains to be seen. So far there haven't been a lot of announcements around that. It remains to be seen what is it that the states will do to step up.